The memo had been slipped into the duty roster like it belonged there. That was what bothered Peter Sims most. Not the content, not the language, not even the signature at the bottom, though all three of those would come to bother him considerably in the hours that followed. What bothered him first, standing in the guardroom at Buckingham Palace on a gray October morning in 1940, was the casual confidence of its placement. Whoever had sent it expected no resistance. They had tucked a suspension order into the middle of a routine duty packet the way you tuck a receipt into a coat pocket. Unremarkable, forgettable, done. Sims was 19 years old and had been with the Coldstream Guards for 11 months. He was not, by his own admission or anyone else's, a particularly complicated young man. He liked orderly things. He liked knowing where the lines were. He had joined the Guards in part because everything about the regiment communicated exactly that here are the lines, here is what falls inside them, here is what does not. So when something landed in the wrong place, he noticed. It was almost involuntary, the way a musician notices a wrong note in a familiar piece. He read the memo 3 times standing beside the duty board, his morning tea going cold on the window ledge behind him. War Office, Wartime Efficiency and Resource Committee, Ref. CER 4118, effective 4th November 1940, ceremonial guard rotation at Buckingham Palace, St. James's Palace and the Tower of London to be suspended until further notice. Grounds, non-essential personnel deployment during active aerial threat conditions. Manpower to be reassigned to civil defense and anti-aircraft auxiliary units. Ceremonial resumption pending cessation of hostilities. Signed, Edmund Hale, Senior Administrative Officer, Wartime Resource Division. Sims set the memo down on the ledge beside his tea. He picked the tea up. He set it down again without drinking any. He thought about going to Corporal Davis. Davis was technically his immediate superior and the correct procedural route for anything that seemed irregular. But Davis had a habit of making things disappear, not through malice, just through a deep institutional preference for calm mornings and no complications before noon. This would not survive Davis. Sims thought about the regimental office. He thought about the duty officer. He thought about all the official channels that a memo this confident had clearly already passed through without anyone stopping it. Then he thought about Thomas Alcott. Regimental Sergeant Major Thomas Alcott had been with the Coldstream Guards for 22 years. He had served in India, in Egypt, and along the Western Front's lingering administrative aftermath. He was 51 years old, built like a piece of Tudor architecture, solid, slightly intimidating, and apparently designed to last several centuries without significant maintenance. He did not have a reputation for warmth. He had a reputation for accuracy, which Sims had come to understand was considerably more useful. He found Alcott in the equipment room, methodically inspecting a row of bearskins with the focused attention of a surgeon examining an X-ray. "Sergeant Major," Sims held out the memo. "You should probably read this." Alcott took it without looking up from the bearskin he was examining. He finished his inspection first, set the hat down precisely, then read. His expression did not change. His posture did not shift. But something in the room shifted anyway, the way air pressure changes before weather arrives. "Where did you find this, Sims?" "It was in the duty packet, sir, between the roster change and the supply requisition form." Alcott folded the memo along its original crease and placed it in his breast pocket. He picked up the next bearskin. "Carry on with your morning," he said. "Tell no one else about this yet." "Yes, sir." Sims left. He did carry on with his morning, but he spent most of it watching the guardroom door, waiting to see what Thomas Alcott would do next. Because in 11 months of service, he had learned one thing with complete certainty about the sergeant major. When Alcott said yet, he always meant soon. Alcott waited until the equipment room was empty before he took the memo out again. He read it a second time slowly, the way he read anything that required a decision, not scanning for information, but listening for the spaces between the words, the things the language was choosing not to say. The words non-essential appeared twice. Ceremonial redundancy appeared once, in the third paragraph, and it was that phrase that told him everything he needed to know about Edmund Hale. A man who understood what the changing of the guard actually was would never have used those two words together. You might as well describe a lighthouse as decorative illumination. He had been in London for 6 weeks of the Blitz by this point. He had watched the city take its punishment with the particular stubbornness of a place that has been burned before and rebuilt before, and intends to go on doing both indefinitely. He had stood at his window on 3 separate nights and watched the eastern sky turn orange while the anti-aircraft guns argued with the darkness. He had seen the morning after streets, the shattered glass swept into careful piles, the boarded windows, the hand-lettered signs on damaged shopfronts reading more open than usual and Hitler will not close us, and once memorably, our windows are gone but our spirits are not, and we still sell excellent tea. That was the thing Edmund Hale and his committee had apparently failed to understand about the streets of London in October 1940. The people were still there. Not as many as before, certainly. The children had been evacuated, many of the women with them, and the elderly who had anywhere else to go had gone. But the ones who remained, the dock workers and the bus drivers and the shop women and the wardens and the nurses and the men too old to fight and the men waiting to be called, they were still moving through those streets every single day. And they were watching. Alcott had seen it himself on the days the guard had performed the ceremony in spite of everything. He had watched faces change on the pavement. Not dramatically, not in the way the newsreel cameras tried to capture. Quietly. Something in the jaw relaxing. Something behind the eyes settling into a place of steadiness that had not been there a moment before. It happened in seconds and it lasted, he believed, considerably longer than that. He had no scientific language for what he was observing. He only knew that it was real, and that it mattered in ways that could not be measured by any committee operating out of Whitehall. He spent 40 minutes in the equipment room, making notes in his service book in the small, precise handwriting that 22 years of record-keeping had produced. Then he went to the regimental telephone and placed a call to a man named Geoffrey Marsh. Marsh was a retired lieutenant colonel who now occupied a quiet administrative post somewhere in the upper floors of the War Office, the kind of post that sounds minor but isn't, occupied by people who know where everything is filed and who signed what and when. Alcott had known him since 1926. They did not speak often. When they did, it was never about nothing. "Geoffrey, it's Alcott." "Thomas," a pause. "You're calling about the Hale memo. You've seen it." "I drafted the objection to it 3 days ago. It was overruled by 2 members of the committee before it reached the full table." Marsh's voice carried the particular exhaustion of a man who has been correct about something and ignored for it. "The committee meets again Thursday to confirm the suspension formally. If it's confirmed Thursday, the order takes effect November 4th as written." "Who else is on the committee?" "Hale leads it. 2 civilian administrators from the Treasury side, 1 from the Ministry of Works, 1 military liaison, a major named Carrington who I'm told has never actually commanded a ceremonial unit in his life. They are unanimous, Thomas. They've run the numbers on the manpower and they find the ceremony wasteful. That's the word they're using. Wasteful." Alcott looked at the wall. "Wasteful. I know. I need to be in that room on Thursday, Geoffrey." The silence on the other end lasted exactly long enough to mean yes. "I'll arrange a visitor's pass. You'll be listed as a technical consultant on ceremonial security protocols. Don't wear your full dress. Come in service uniform and carry something that looks administrative." Alcott looked down at the service book in his hand. "I'll manage." "Thomas," Marsh's voice dropped slightly. "They're not wrong about the numbers. On paper, the ceremony costs real manpower and real resources. If you go in there and argue tradition, they'll bury you in 5 minutes." "I'm not going to argue tradition," Alcott said. I'm going to argue strategy." He replaced the receiver. He looked again at the folded memo in his breast pocket, then at his service book, then at the notes he had made. Then he went to find the one piece of documentation he needed, something he had not thought about in almost a year, something that had been sitting in a locked dispatch case in his quarters since the summer, because the person who had given it to him had said simply, "Keep this close, Thomas. You may need it before this war is over." He had not understood it fully then. He understood it completely now. Thursday arrived with the specific grimness London had perfected that autumn, low cloud, cold air carrying the faint smell of brick dust, and something chemical that everyone had learned not to identify too precisely. Alcott left the palace at 7:40 in the morning, which gave him 2 hours before the committee convened, and exactly enough time to walk part of the route the guard used for the ceremony. He did this deliberately. He wanted to see the streets as they were on a Thursday morning in October 1940, not as they appeared in committee papers or resource allocation spreadsheets. He walked from the palace along the mall, past the sandbagged monument bases and the anti-aircraft emplacements half hidden behind walls of Hessian sacking, past the park with its surface trenches and its strange new landscape of practical ugliness imposed on ceremonial beauty. 3 women passed him walking the other direction, talking in low voices about something domestic. A postman cycled past with his usual morning certainty. 2 elderly men stood outside a closed cafe, one reading a newspaper, one watching the sky with the evaluating expression Londoners had developed for cloud cover, not aesthetic appreciation, but tactical assessment. Is that the kind of cloud that gives German bombers cover or the kind that grounds them? At the junction where the mall met the Victoria Memorial, Alcott stopped. He stood there for 2 full minutes. On a normal morning before the war, this junction would have been thick with people by now, tourists, office workers, delivery vans, the general noise of a capital city conducting its business. Today there were perhaps 30 people in his entire line of sight. The streets were not empty, but they were quieter than they should have been, in the way that a familiar piece of music played at half its usual volume still sounds like itself, but also sounds like something has been taken from it. He thought about what those 30 people would see at 11 o'clock if the guard did not come. Then he walked on toward Whitehall. The War Office building received him with the institutional indifference of a place that processes several hundred visitors daily and has strong opinions about lanyards. Marsh's visitor pass was waiting at the security desk, exactly as promised. Alcott clipped it to his service uniform, picked up his dispatch case, and moved through the corridors with the unhurried steadiness he had described once to a young officer as the most important professional skill he possessed. Not speed, not rank, not the ability to project authority. The ability to walk into any room as though your presence there has already been approved by everyone who matters. He passed 2 Ministry of Works clerks carrying rolled maps. He passed a young woman typing at a desk in an open corridor, apparently indifferent to the building's complete lack of conventional office boundaries. He passed a door marked Resource Allocation, Wartime Division, and did not pause to look at it, though he noted the room number. The committee room was on the 3rd floor. Marsh was waiting outside it, holding a cup of tea with the expression of a man performing composure. "They're already inside," Marsh said quietly. Hale arrived early. He set up a presentation. Actual charts, Thomas, on a board. Alcott looked at the door. "How long do I have before the formal session begins?" 8 minutes. "That's sufficient," Alcott said, and went inside. Edmund Hale was younger than Alcott had expected. That was the first thing. He had constructed, from the language of the memo and the confidence of its placement, an image of a seasoned Whitehall mandarin, gray-templed, measured, the kind of bureaucratic authority that accretes over decades. The man standing beside the presentation board was perhaps 40, lean and precise in a dark suit, with the manner of someone who has recently discovered efficiency as a philosophy and intends to apply it universally. The charts were, as Marsh had warned, real, 3 of them, manpower allocation columns, Cost projections. A comparative table of ceremonial activity across royal residences, with the hours highlighted in red. 2 treasury administrators sat at the left side of the table, both in suits of similar darkness. Both with the identical expression of men who have already made up their minds and are present mainly for procedural completeness. Major Carrington of the military liaison sat at the table's right end, ramrod posture, eyes forward, contributing the visual impression of military approval without any apparent intention of saying anything substantive. Alcott sat down across from Hale, placed his dispatch case on the table, and folded his hands over it. Hale looked at him with the brief uncertainty of someone who has not been briefed on a new attendee. Technical consultation, Marsh said from the doorway. Ceremonial security protocols. Hale accepted this with a short nod and began. The presentation was thorough. Alcott gave him that. Hale walked through the numbers with real precision: personnel hours, transport costs, the deployment calculations that showed exactly how many men were standing at palace gates performing rotation ceremonies when those same men could theoretically be reinforcing civil defense rosters or anti-aircraft auxiliaries. He spoke without notes, which meant he had memorized this, which meant he believed in it completely. That was important to understand. Edmund Hale was not cynical, he was convinced. When he finished, one of the Treasury men nodded. The other made a mark on his paper. Carrington continued looking at the middle distance. Sergeant Major. Hale turned to Alcott with the courtesy of someone extending a professional formality. You've been brought in to address security protocol implications. Please. Alcott did not open his dispatch case. Before I address protocols, he said, I'd like to ask you something, Mr. Hale. In the weeks since the Blitz began, have you spent any time on the streets in the neighborhoods surrounding the palace between, say, 10 o'clock and noon on a weekday morning? Hale's expression registered the question as slightly off-topic. I have traveled through those areas, yes, in connection with various site assessments. On foot. By car primarily. Alcott nodded once, as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. The people on those streets, he said. When the guard performs the ceremony, when the drums come down the mall and the regiment moves through the gates, what do you imagine they do? Hale looked at him with the patient expression of a man being asked to engage with sentiment during a resource allocation meeting. Sergeant Major, with respect, the morale argument has been made and considered. We are not dismissing the symbolic value of ceremonial. I'm not talking about symbolic value, Alcott said. His voice was completely level. I'm talking about operational function. The room shifted slightly. The Treasury man on the left looked up from his paper. Alcott continued. In the first week of September, the night raids had been running for 11 consecutive days. Civilian sleep deprivation in central London was producing what the medical reports were calling decision fatigue, an inability to maintain routine, a tendency toward passivity, a measurable reduction in the behaviors associated with sustained civil function. People were not going to work. They were not maintaining their households. They were not, in the language of the civil defense assessors, performing the ordinary actions of ordinary life. Which sounds minor until you understand that ordinary life, performed visibly and repeatedly in public, is the single most powerful communication a civilian population can send to an enemy conducting a terror campaign. Hale was listening. That was something. The changing of the guard, Alcott said, is performed at 11 o'clock. It runs for approximately 45 minutes. It is loud. It is deliberate. It is absolutely and completely predictable. In a city where nothing else is predictable, where people go to sleep not knowing whether their street will exist in the morning, something that happens at 11 o'clock because it always happens at 11 o'clock is not decoration. He paused. It is proof. Proof that the institution endures. Proof that the schedule holds. Proof that whatever came down from the sky last night did not change what happens this morning. And proof Mr. Hale, he looked at him directly, that we have decided not to hide. Silence in the room. One of the Treasury men cleared his throat. That's a rather expansive interpretation of a personnel rotation ceremony. It is also, Alcott said, the interpretation held by the German propaganda ministry. He opened the dispatch case. Inside were 3 documents. He removed them and placed them on the table with careful spacing. The first was a translated transcript of a German radio broadcast from the 7th of September, the 3rd day of the Blitz, in which a commentator had described the continuation of royal ceremonial activity in London as evidence that the British government was, in the broadcaster's words, performing defiance for public consumption while privately preparing capitulation. The broadcast had urged German listeners to wait for the ceremonies to stop, because when they stopped, it would signal that the British themselves no longer believed in their own resilience. Alcott let them read it. They were waiting, he said, for us to cancel it. The moment we do, they will broadcast that cancellation as a victory, not a military victory, a psychological one. The palace goes quiet, the ceremony stops, and German radio tells its audience that London has accepted the new reality, that the British crown has retreated indoors. He tapped the transcript. They have been watching this ceremony for 6 weeks. It has appeared in 3 separate German propaganda assessments as a target, not for bombs, but for broadcast. The moment it stops, they win a battle that no anti-aircraft gun can fight for us. Hale was very still. Alcott placed the second document beside the first. This was a civil defense report from the 3rd week of September, compiled by wardens in Westminster and Chelsea. It documented a measurable increase in civilian street activity on the mornings following guard ceremonies. People choosing to walk rather than shelter, shops opening earlier. The ordinary rhythms of London life reasserting themselves in the hours after the drums had come down the mall. The warden who had compiled it had not drawn any conclusions. He had simply recorded what he observed. Alcott had drawn his own. The 3rd document he left face down for a moment. Mr. Hale, he said, you are correct that the ceremony costs manpower. You are correct that in a strict resource calculation, those men could be deployed elsewhere. He looked around the table, but you have calculated the cost of continuing. You have not calculated the cost of stopping, and those are not the same number. Hale leaned forward. Then give me the number, Sergeant Major. Alcott turned over the 3rd document. It was a single page, a memorandum handwritten. On paper bearing a heading that produced a very specific quality of silence in the room when the men around the table read it. Not the silence of boredom or impatience. The silence of people recalibrating what kind of meeting they are in. The handwriting was clear, deliberate, and entirely recognizable to anyone who had ever seen a signed royal document. I'll let you read it, Alcott said and sat back. The memorandum had been written in August. Alcott knew this because he had been present indirectly at the conversation that preceded it. He had been standing outside a ground-floor corridor of the palace on an evening in mid-August when a senior equerry had come to find him with an unusual request. The king would like to speak briefly with a senior member of the ceremonial regiment. Not formally, not officially, just briefly. He had stood in a small sitting room that smelled of old paper and wood polish, while George V.I. sat in a chair by the window, watching the darkening sky with the expression of a man doing complicated arithmetic in his head. The king had a stammer that he managed with careful, deliberate packing, and he spoke that evening with the unhurried cadence of someone who has made peace with taking the time he needs. He had asked Alcott 2 questions. The first, what did the men of the regiment feel performing the ceremony while the city was being bombed? The second, what did Alcott himself believe it was accomplishing? Alcott had answered both questions honestly. 3 days later, the equerry had appeared at his quarters with a sealed envelope and the instruction he had already mentioned. Keep this close, Thomas. You may need it. Now the men around the table in the War Office Committee room were reading it. It was not long. George VI was not a man who used more words than a situation required. The memorandum stated clearly that the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace was to continue throughout the duration of hostilities, except in cases of direct, imminent physical threat to the participants. It stated that this was not a traditional preference or a ceremonial nicety. It was a strategic directive, arrived at after personal observation and consultation, grounded in the king's assessment of what the ceremony communicated to the civilian population of London and to the foreign observers, friendly and otherwise, who were watching the capital for signs of institutional collapse. The final line read, "A nation that continues its ceremonies continues its confidence. This is not theater, this is governance." Signed with the date and the full formal signature. Hale read it twice. Then he set it down with the careful movement of someone returning a document to a surface rather than releasing it. The two Treasury administrators exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation. Carrington, for the first time since the meeting began, appeared to be genuinely paying attention. "This was issued in August," Hale said. "It was not communicated to this committee." "No," Alcott agreed. "It was communicated to me."